Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the shocking story of George Foreman. He was a two-time heavyweight before champion prior to serving as the spokesperson for the renowned grill that is named after him. George Foreman was but a child, battling for their lives on the streets of Houston, but he did more than simply make it through. Defeated with faith, a fist, and an unwavering spirit, the Foreman constructed one of the most amazing sports lives history. Yet beneath the grins and success came to a man who faced few demons ever witnessed, and when he died he left behind anything at the age of 76 that shocked everyone by winning a huge sum. Lovingly cooked with private correspondence that helped his kids cry uncontrollably. This isn't simply this boxer's narrative is the tale of a man who rose out of nothing, lost everything, restored it, and established a legacy. This is considerably richer than money could quantify. Is George Foreman's untold story. George Foreman's last and finest gift. The narrative didn't start with flashing lights or title belts, it started in the harsh streets of the 5th District of Houston. George Ward was born on January 10, 1949. Was the 6th child out of 7 in a family that endured hardships in each and every day to support his biological Leroy Moorhead. The father was absent, and Nancy Foreman, George's mother, wedded J.D. Foreman, a man who attempted to maintain the whole family on a janitor's. As a child, George was upset about his income. Poor, harassed, and frequently in trouble, he wandered the streets and engaged in combat with everyone who stared at him. It didn't matter whose school he attended. For him, food frequently equated to nice shoes. Did not fit in every situation, and throughout the world he lived in a world where survival wasn't a game. By the time he was a teenager, life and death. George, a teenager, has already begun stealing and going down a perilous path, fighting and having only dreams about escape. One evening while fleeing he understood that if he didn't call the cops change, he would die or fall behind bars that were pressed. In the desperate moment at the age of 16, he joined the Job Corps. Federal initiative intended to assist troubled kids pick up skills and construct in the future. It was in Oregon that George discovered his purpose after being introduced to boxing under Doc Brous, a tutor. Immediately, the Foreman displayed pure terror. Although he wasn't refined, powerful, unusually powerful, Brous molded him as a man as well as a boxer, establishing in him a sense of discipline, purpose, and George accepted a new Olympic dream. He trained it like a lifeline, steadfastly changing his life day by day, punch by punch, and when he entered the ring during the 1968 Mexico at the City Olympics, he brought not only his personal aspirations, but each person's. Foreman, the forgotten child, returned home. He plowed his way along the tournament, taking home the gold medal with unadulterated violence and overwhelming power. Upon his arrival at the podium, he waved a small American flag that the globe witnessed a potential champion, but George noticed something. If not evidence that a gutter boy could grow into a man the world needed to honor, but he was unaware that the struggle to remain at the top would be equal, more difficult than the battle to arrive fresh away from his Olympic victory. George Foreman transformed into a professional, and he didn't simply win, he demolished. From 1969 to 1973. He amassed an unbeaten record, destroying adversaries with loud. Few people have ever witnessed power, and each punch was a declaration that George Foreman wasn't only he was a force of nature and another combatant. Then the funds began to come in. Fans adored him, and promoters adored him. He was adored by networks for his first big. When he faced Joe in 1973, he received payment for the heavyweight title. Frazier of the world's unbeaten Frazier and Furious was supposed to stand up for his crown, but Foreman took him apart and he was knocked down 6 after 2 vicious rounds. In one of the most prominent titles at times overnight victories in history, Foreman went from a brawler with a hard neck to endorsement deals with rich stars. Following expensive automobiles, bright suits, and expensive homes were incorporated into the new. He had made it to reality, and everyone those around him were aware, but the celebrity wasn't. He wasn't comfortable sitting on Foreman's shoulder. Ali, who has a sharp tongue and brilliant charisma. George was more reserved, irritable, and set aside, and as the funds accumulated so did the seclusion he once acknowledged. As his wealth increased, he felt more alone. Recognizing that a large number of those around him was more concerned with his pocketbook than his health, Foreman persisted in his fight. Defended his championship in frightful challenges that flatten efficiency, such as Jose Roman and Ken Norton, but the test was a battle in 1974 that would describe him, whether positively or negatively, the Rumble versus Muhammad in the jungle. Ali Foreman came into the battle as an overwhelming favorite and invincible juggernaut, but Ali's crafty mind and irreversible will have different ideas. Utilizing the now famous rope-a-dope plan, Ali allowed Foreman to strike himself out, and in the 8th, knocked him out. Foreman's spirit was broken by that loss. Not only because the title was taken away from him, but because he no longer exuded the air of suddenly, unexpectedly. George wasn't the unstoppable monster, but he was weak. And the door was opened by that vulnerability to a very new type of conflict, one that would almost cost him everything. Following Ali's defeat, the life and career of George Foreman went into disarray. The millions he earned didn't purchase the home's tranquility. None of the jewels or cars filled the gap created by that one terrible night. He fought and won several fights in Zur, losing others, but it wasn't the fire that his rage at the engine was even worse. After he gained authority, his dominance started to. Friends observed that he became consumed. Unpredictable lash out and withdrawal descending into a profound sadness that no certain sum of money could correct. The turning point occurred in 1977 during a startling Puerto Rico loses to Jimmy Young. Foreman, fatigued and dehydrated, stumbled back to his changing area and collapsed. He subsequently explained what occurred next, but not as an episode of fainting, but an actual near-death encounter. George asserted that he sensed his own death descending into the shadows before observing images of God's forgiveness and compassion. At that point, he begged for a moment possibility of survival if he pledged to live a life devoted to his beliefs, not notoriety. When Foreman got back consciousness, he was irrevocably altered. He immediately retired from boxing without a last paycheck or goodbye tour. George, just quiet for the ensuing 10 years. Foreman disappeared from the spotlight. Became a licensed clergyman, launching the Lord Jesus Christ's Church, and he preached in Houston to everyone who would listen, to empty pews occasionally. Barely over the poverty line in comparison to he spent years trying to get his previous wealth. To make amends for his youthful transgressions, returning to the community by providing food for the poor people, providing homeless people with housing. However, financial difficulties threatened. The fortune he formerly held slipped out due to poor, inadequate financial management of investments. Given the enormous expense of maintaining his ministries operating by the middle of the 1980s, formerly the wealthiest fighter was George Foreman. He didn't have any money in the world. Complain. He didn't file a lawsuit, he just kept preaching, continued to be happy, but his family required more because his kids were becoming older. His expenses were growing, so the unimaginable ideas started to surface. At George Foreman is almost 40 years old. Determined that it was time to battle once more, not for honor, not retaliation, but for when George Foreman declared survival. When he returned in 1987, the majority of the boxing, he was about 40 years old when the world chuckled. Overweight and hadn't engaged in combat for more than a fan snorted as reporters made fun of him for 10 years. And promoters questioned if anyone would even come watch him battle, but the loudness didn't concern the Foreman. Was pursuing something other than headlines. Stability for his Foreman family. Went back to the ring with almost 270 pounds on his body, a huge contrast to the destroyed juggernaut that once tormented the classification of heavyweights. However, he leaned into it, taking in the picture of the amiable obese man who was nonetheless able to vicious blow. He was aware that he had changed. Physical combatant, yet he possessed something that many of his younger rivals didn't feel: the heartbeat and an unbreakable will. Engage in battle after battle. George prevailed, tearing past the journeyman and marginal candidates gradually rising rankings. However, it wasn't only the triumphs that captured the hearts of the public. His sullen attitude was gone. This fearsome figure from the 1970s, George Foreman, grinned and made jokes. Interviewed him and made fun of his own weight. He rose to fame in the media, demonstrating that kindness and toughness could coexist. With the ascent concluded in 1994 when the 45-year-old Michael Moore was challenged by Foreman for the Moira won the heavyweight title at the age of 19 years younger, unbeaten, and considerably preferred for the first 9 rounds. Punches were absorbed by the Foreman, who was outboxed while remaining composed, and then in the 10th he landed a right-hand round that altered all of that, and the fall of the George Foreman was counted out by the referee. Became the oldest despite all odds heavyweight champion in the history of boxing. It wasn't just a personal moment. Triumph, it was a triumph for all underdog who had previously been informed that they were too old, too damaged, and too long gone. The Foreman silently dropped to his knees. His wounded hands were still wrapped in prayer. Throughout history, and that belt was accompanied by something more significant than boasting financial stability and rights, but George wasn't done creating his finest. There was still no financial move, and it wouldn't take place inside the ring. Following George regained his heavyweight title, Foreman had accomplished a few sportsmen have ever achieved a second prime, yet he was aware that boxing was short-lived. Indefinitely, so when the time came, George opened the door in a surprising manner. In the middle of the 1990s, Foreman was asked to support a novel form of offer, an electric grill that reduces fat. At first, a heavyweight looked absurd. Champion promoting a kitchen gadget. However, Foreman noticed something nobody else did. Was he able to comprehend the American public? Loved 2 things, delectable cuisine and feeling better, especially if he's a charming former champion could promote the concept of grilling meatless dishes. It might merely work, it wasn't a success right away. Infomercials in the beginning were unpleasant, but the sincere charm and relatability of George made the difference. Without acting as though he just revealed to the world that he is a chef. Enjoyed burgers, and this grill turned them into healthy. His huge smile, and his hearty laugh and his unwavering honesty transformed the grilling George Foreman into a cultural. Sales of the phenomena skyrocketed by the early in the 2000s, more than 100 million grills were sold. The agreement that Foreman the negotiation was excellent rather than merely he negotiated a flat endorsement price. Proportion of earnings throughout time. Sultan Incanan, the business that created the in 1999, grill purchased his rights. The Foreman left with an estimated payday is $138 million more than ever before. The grill wasn't merely padded when it was boxed. His family's financial situation had altered. Future as opposed to his initial wealth, which had escaped from his grasp. This when George was wise, he made an investment in he established trusts in real estate. In order to diversify his holdings, George Foreman Grill emerged as the mainstay of and dominion beyond the realm of boxing, beyond the realm of celebrities and into the realm of American businessmanship. Made him not only a rich man, but also among the few sportsmen who had actually defeated the financial disadvantages. But despite his wealth, George never forgot his origins as he grew up. Behind him or for whom he was fighting the renown, wealth, and smile public perception of George Foreman's pulse primarily because of his family. He had 12 children, 5 of which were sons. All renowned for having the names George, and 7 the George family's daughters weren't merely when he was important, it was everything. He had promised that if he was young and impoverished, ever achieved success, his kids would never need to lead the life he didn't have. No more darkness, no more terror, and more hunger. Unsure whether the lights will remain on, and as promised, Foreman made advantage of his wealth to create a safety net for his family. He paid for their houses, their university education, and provided assistance them in starting their own companies. Various professions, but it wasn't solely about giving them money was the goal. The chance, he once stated in an interview, you can't raise your children with money. You must be present. And George had a hectic schedule, yet he is very much a part of their life. Attended athletic events and school productions. And if feasible, family dinners was more than simply a supplier, he was a presence. Additionally, he ensured that his estate was airtight. Foreman arranged a number of trusts to guarantee that upon his passing his wealth would be dispersed fairly and carefully. His objective was straightforward. No fighting, no court cases, stories about a family that is surviving as he had always desired. Together each of his kids received a letter. George's private messages. He was full of love, wisdom, and he didn't mention memory in those letters. He discussed his beliefs in relation to money. Tenacity regarding kindness, regarding what the Foreman name was intended to be, carried with humility and pride. By the time when Foreman passed away, he hadn't simply ensured the financial future of his family, he had strengthened their basis. As will soon as any bank account observe when his life's last chapter as events transpired, the millions that brought his kids to tears, it was the father who provided them with all that genuinely departed the largest hole over the years. Even the unbreakable frame of George Foreman started to exhibit wear after decades of retribution in the ring wars of boxing alongside men such as Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Numerous others, including Ron Lyle, departed his body beaten in ways that are impossible to money could repair. He had several knee replacements, hip replacements, and operations, actions and protocols for fixing residual harm from previous injuries. Chronic back discomfort started to interfere with daily life. His hands were formerly renowned for bringing the most lethal heavyweight punches. History became rigid and bloated with. He made a joke about his arthritis in interviews, but close companions were aware that it was despite the physical discomfort. Don't laugh. Wasn't the only factor slowing him down. The downed Foreman also struggled with his heart in a literal sense as well as a spiritual one. Rumors in the early 2010s, rumors that he had received a diagnosis, severe cardiac issues resulting from years of physical stress and hefty changes in weight during the course of his career, but he kept most information confidential. According to many who knew him, Foreman was silently getting ready for the following stage of the time in his life when battling wasn't an alternative to public appearances became less common, and the long lengths of meetings and media tours welcomes him when he arrives, whether at boxing matches or charitable gatherings. He leaned more on family and progressed more slowly. Members and frequently required medical personnel close by, yet George never voiced any complaints. Instead, he dug more deeply into his faith. Family and into days of uncomplicated joy were devoted to caring for his ranch and fishing. Arranging Sunday barbecues and reflecting regarding the time when everyone knew him as the champion of heavyweight. What many didn't understand that was behind the George's calm public persona was also putting up endless effort to ensure all preparations were made for. After he was financial planner, lawyer, and gone estate, he spent hours creating a trust organizer. Yes, there wouldn't be any misunderstandings. Judicial battle. There is no resentment among his. He was aware that his time was running out and, similar to George Foreman in the ring, had no intention of leaving anything incomplete. The news broke in early 2025 like a George Foreman's thunderclap had been critically ill in the hospital. Early reports were ambiguous, merely noting that the renowned champion was subject to strict medical monitoring. After fans of catastrophic health emergencies flooded tributes and prayers on social media, boxing famous people and millions of ordinary people held their breath, waiting for information that never appeared to the Foreman's family stayed largely silently, making a single message that we request for prayer and privacy throughout this really challenging period of time. Days after the death of George Foreman on March 9, 2025, resting in peace with his family. He was 76 years old at his Texas ranch. His passing sent shockwaves through news outlets around the world. Carried tributes. Mike Tyson, Evander and other fighters, Deontay and Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, Wilder shared heartfelt posts. Even actors and musicians who are not boxers, politicians paused to pay tribute to the giant. He had evolved into so much more than a warrior, but as the public lamented, a legend within the Foreman residence, a far more private situation was played out. George's grandchildren, kids, and best pals got together not only to mourn, but to honor the life of the. They didn't know him as the champion, but only as a buddy, dad, grandfather, and there were a few private funeral services. No huge public spectacle, no fireworks. George designed that, and he had especially asked for a small, straightforward goodbye, one that was full with stories about laughter, faith and family. Throughout the event, letter passages were read by the eldest son. George has corresponded with all of his kids' phrases that would shortly result in letters filled with sorrow from the entire family, not with guidelines for how to spend the he left behind wealth, but with life teachings he gave on thankfulness in life, humility, honesty, faith, and love. George Foreman's punch was more forceful than he struck any man who was still alive in death. More difficult, but this time directly to the. When the Foreman family sat down, my heart with lawyers to listen to the reading of, they were ready for the will. Fundamentals, allocations, trusts, and inheritances. What caught them off guard was the extent of George Foreman's remaining behind. Projections showed that Foreman's the value of the estate exceeded $300 million. Constructed not only from a boxing purses but additionally, the royalties from George Smart Real Estate for Foreman Grill investments in California and Texas, book royalties, endorsement agreements, and a carefully managed licensing business. But even more formidable than the George's particular